Good morning, class. I hope everyone is doing well and recovering from our midterm last week. This week we're going to be turning our attention to feminist ethics, which is going to be a new take on a lot of the stuff we've been talking about already. Um, and it's going to be one of those theories that starts to push back against some of the more traditional approaches to ethics that we've seen so far in this class. But it's also signaling kind of a transition point uh, in what we'll be covering for the rest of this term. Because whether we're looking at feminist ethics, ethics of equality, economic ethics, we're going to be starting to look at some of the modern responses to many of the classical theories that we have talked about so far. Evaluating maybe some of the blind spots, the gaps, and the weaknesses. So, hopefully, it'll be enlightening for you. But before we do that, what we need to do this week is talk about our ethics paper that's going to come up in this class. So, we do have a formal paper to write, but in some ways, it's less of a formal research paper and more like an extended response paper. I'll just read over the instructions. So it's going to be due on December 11th. It's the very last week of class before the final. The length is going to be 3 pages minimum, double spaced. But that's not actually that too terribly long. Um, it's not going to be, it's not something you will have to spend months and months and months writing, which is why I wait till after the midterm to give it. But what I want you to do is to select a text from your own cultural atmosphere. This can be a song, a movie, a book, or even a real world event. And I want your paper to analyze that text by using two different ethical theories, then conclude with your own ethical opinion of the text as well. For example, you could look at the TV show How I Met Your Mother and evaluate an episode from a utilitarian perspective. Does the show fail or succeed in moral utility? And then maybe from a perspective of economic justice. And then follow those two analyses with your own moral perspective on the episode. Um, so, what I want you to do is to start to connect the theories that we've been talking about this semester to your world. So the first thing you want to do is start with something that's meaningful to you. Uh, Whether it's a TV show that you watch, songs that you listen to, books that you're reading, newspaper articles, magazine articles, maybe people you run into on a regular basis, or something that's really, really impacted your life. And then I want you to start thinking about those things from a moral lens. What would Immanuel Kant have to say about this? Does this rise and succeed his universalizing principle? What would John Stuart Mills, the utilitarian, how would he look at this book you're reading and the characters? Um, and how would he evaluate their lives and their actions? Do they fulfill the greatest happiness principle? Are they maximizing as much happiness for? Are they making the best decisions possible, or are they making morally bad decisions by causing harm and damage to everyone? Um, and so this assignment, again, it's not necessarily a research paper. It's a paper that's designed to get you guys to see the ethical theories that we've been discussing in our everyday lives. And that's mainly where I want us to go with this. I want this paper to be personal. Um, and I'll give you guys a more full breakdown of what's going on in the paper. Um, a little document that you could print out and look at. But it's going to be broken down into 4 parts. And once you kind of like see how it's going to go, um, it's pretty formulaic, and so you guys shouldn't have a huge problem with it. Um, First part of the paper is just going to be explaining the cultural text. What is this thing that we're going to be looking at? Why are we looking at it? And then, providing a short summary of what's going on. Because, if you want to um, write an ethical paper on the Chinese dinner episode with Seinfeld, we may not all be familiar with that. But, you're going to start off your paper by explaining the more important parts of it. And then the next part will be where you pick one ethical theory: moral egoism, relativism, contractarianism, virtue ethics, whatever you want, and analyze that episode from that moral perspective. Then your third section will be a second ethical perspective. And then the last section will be your own ethical perspective, where you're telling me why you either resonate with the characters, don't like the characters, why their actions are good, why their actions are bad. Um, and so, doing all that, you guys won't have any problem getting to 3 pages. And I think it's a great way to, you know, I'm able to give you guys questions, discussion board topics about things that are circulating in my ethical landscape, whether we're talking about politics, the election, taxes, voting. I mean, all this stuff is very interesting to me, but, this is a chance for you guys to start to make your own connections to ethics, uh, from your world. So I hope that it's an interesting assignment. I hope that's something that you guys launch into. Um, you definitely want to start thinking about it, um, because even though you have 5 weeks, 6 weeks, you have a little bit of time to get it done. But if you start to delay, and you run out in the last minute, you're going to be stressed out by it. And it's not a paper that's designed to stress you out. Um, so I'd hate for that to happen. Now, I put down at the bottom, you can summarize the ethical theories that you use. So, if you were wanting to talk about Kant, you know, you could say a deontologist would disagree with the actions of character X, Y, Z, because it does not fulfill the universalizing principle. The universalizing principle is the idea that if your action cannot be committed by everyone, then it is not a morally acceptable action. Um, you would need to cite something like that. And for the most part, you can write this paper entirely without any citations, just using kind of the summary descriptions of the different ethical theories that we've discussed. But but if you do use other sources, if you do use other sources than our lectures, you need to cite them, and they must be in MLA format. If you have questions about MLA format, you can definitely email me, or you can go to the Purdue Online Writing Lab, very useful resource for looking things up. Um, but I have had every semester we have someone that has to get into a very serious conversation about plagiarism, because rather than this is all supposed to be a response type of paper, kind of like an extended discussion board um, post, kind of like one of our extended assignments. It's kind of like those essay questions I have on the midterm, just in a more full and fleshed out way. And so, there's really no need for you to go out and pull up a book on um, legal theories of criminal justice. But inevitably, I seem to have someone that wants to do that, and then they just copy and paste stuff straight from somewhere else. And that is always unfortunate, because then we have to have a very serious conversation about um, plagiarism. Uh, so it is response based. Hopefully, you guys get to work on that sooner than later, so you don't feel like you're pushed up against the wall. Um, and then I will also say too, Um, when it comes to the papers, I definitely want you guys to succeed as much as you can. If you want to finish up a rough draft and shoot it to me at some point in the rest of the semester, pretty much all the way up until a week before, I'll take a rough draft and read it, give you some feedback. Um, Anything from, I can scrutinize every single word you use and give you long, detailed feedback, or just, general, this is where the paper is, this is the quality of it, this is how you can make it a little bit better. So, a lot of different ways I can try to help you out with that too. Um, but I'm always more than happy to help you guys with working on this paper, provided that, you get it to me a little earlier than later. So, enough about the paper. Let us now turn our attention to feminist ethics. And before we really start to get into this, we're going to talk a little bit about how we evaluate moral attitudes, because this contributes very heavily, specifically through a few studies that hopefully will come up in your textbook when you're sitting and looking at them. That kind of change the way we see morality, especially within the difference between the genders. So one way that we can evaluate moral attitudes, like say you just go out to a society and you say, I want to figure out what is y'all's morals. How do you guys think what you think? Well, a good way to do this is an empirical study. And by that, what we mean is a scientifically driven sort of analytical study that's going to be heavy on statistics, on the broad base of the culture that you're looking at. So, like, if we wanted to do kind of like an empirical study on morality right now, you would do something along the lines of, you could send out questionnaires or phone surveys, or you could get everyone in the school to respond. And you would ask questions. Do you agree with capital punishment? What do you think about drug laws? you know, what do you think about this sort of thing? What do you think about that sort of thing? And you would be collecting lots and lots and lots of data. Lots of data. You could even put people in these sort of experiments, um, to where you see how do people actually respond in moral situations. The most famous of such experiments, for those of you that have taken psychology, this should just be a refresher, but it's the milligram experiments. And in this sort of psychological study, what they did was they had one person who was answering questions, one person that was asking questions, and the doctor sat behind the person who was asking the questions and overseed the study. And whenever the person answering the questions got a question wrong, the person who was asking the questions was supposed to deliver an electric shock. And he couldn't see the person that was answering questions. So instead, all he knew was that he was flicking a switch, and then the person who was answering questions would scream. Now, as it turns out, it was all a ruse. The person answering questions was actually an actor. He wasn't being shocked. He was just pretending to be. But the person asking the questions had no idea. And what the doctor would do was continually encourage him to give more and more electricity every time the person got the question wrong. And he had this giant switchboard full of switches that he thought were delivering electricity, and it went from mild to medium to strong to very strong to lethal. And in something like 2/3 of the cases, actually I think it was more. I think it was 80% of the cases. I have to go back and double check. But in the majority of the cases, the person asking the questions would go all the way up to delivering a lethal shock. And this is huge. This is huge. They'd be listening to this person screaming. They'd be listening to this person saying, "Stop, stop, stop! You can't do this! You can't do this! You can't do this to me!" And the questionnaire would just keep going. And this is testing. This is sort of like this is supposed to be a study of psychology um, that shows how we submit ourselves to order. Because whenever the questionnaire would get a little uncomfortable, the doctor, the person who's overseeing the entire thing would say, "We need you to continue. It's really important that you continue. Please ask another question. Please shock him." And so the questionnaire, who, under normal situations, we would end up saying, "Oh, yeah, he's just a normal guy. We grabbed him off the road. I'm a normal guy. I wouldn't kill someone. I wouldn't give someone the electric chair for missing a trivia question because that's insane." Um, well, when put in the right circumstance, um, the milligram experiment found that a majority of people would do that. And like I said, this was supposed to be a psychology experiment, but at some level, this also functions as a morality experiment. What are the moral attitudes of people? What are they willing to do um, when pressured, when motivated? When someone in a doctor's coat says, "This is important that you do this," and so you suspend your own morality and follow their morality instead. Um, what Milligram was ultimately trying to do, and I don't know that he really, he did succeed in this regard. He was trying to show us how the Nazis, this is coming in post-war Europe, how did the Nazis get to the point where they're willing to gas all those Jews? And Milligram's answer was, look at how quickly we go from "I'm a normal guy" asking questions for a sort of trivia thing to "I'm going to kill this guy with a lethal dose of electricity." In the span of like 30 minutes, they went from a normal human being to murderer. Um, so that's one way that we can look at moral attitudes. We can do surveys, which is a sort of empirical study. We can do these sort of created scenarios, which is an empirical study. And this is different from just, the difference between a survey and what Milligram was doing is that you actually have people not just speculating what I will do, but kind of living out their choices. Another way, though, that we can evaluate moral attitudes are what's called case studies. And case studies are where you, rather than look at a large group of people, look at a very narrow group of people. Um, and so in a case study, what you'll have is um, you'll have a psychologist or a philosopher, whatever we're doing, looking, following the intimate details of one person over a longer period of time, rather than looking at a broad base of many people over a short period of time. And this is where we get to, this is like a Freudian psychology. Franz Fanon, who is this post-colonial philosopher of race, who will hopefully have a little bit of time to talk about next week. Um, but one of the things he did was he had these series of interview sessions where he was looking at this torturer, and this guy, he was a white Algerian, and his job was to literally torture people. Um, when the state brought him in and said this is a bad guy, the torturer then had to extract information. And this is all during that era of African revolution and African independence from their colonial masters. Again, in the post-World War II era. But Fanon does this long series with this guy, and come to find out, he's not distraught about his job. What he's distraught about is that there's times when stressful situations at home arise, he starts to torture his family, be physically abusive, violent. And so he doesn't see anything wrong with torturing, African insurgents, torturing, people there, but going home and torturing his family members, that's bad. But he can't understand why he's doing that, and so Fernand is trying to work with him to understand, to help him to understand that the sort of violence in his life becomes the status quo, the cycle to which he cannot break free. And so that sort of work is what we call a case study, something that's looking very, very intimately at one person. So we can get more detailed responses, detailed analysis of why people do the sort of things that they do, um, which is equally important to the sort of large scale analysis, because seeing those inner workings um, allows us to see our own inner workings. So other things that we can do to look at evaluate moral attitudes is looking at anecdotes, the type of stories that we tell people, and this is like narratives, which is type of the media that we consume, the books that we are reading, the TV shows that we are watching. Um, you know, there's a lot that has been said or can be said about the change um, in American filmmaking, American television shows before and after 9/11, um, to where we lose a sort of optimistic future, to where the shows that come out in the years to follow, um, whether they're shot differently, acted differently. Um, Demonstrate not necessarily a confidence in the American ability to overcome our obstacles, uh, or if they are set, in the case of a show like Jericho, where the worst of the worst has already happened, and now any optimism that we have is something that we have to reconstruct after society itself has collapsed. Um, Even if you look at like the difference between the Star Treks, between Next Generation, Enterprise, how there's this gap in the assumptions of the power of technology, the assumptions of our ability to succeed. Um, but in many ways, people that look at this start to find that the narratives that we're telling, and this is pretty natural, following 9/11, just grow dark. They go very dark. They become pessimistic and cynical about the future, about the use of technology, about the use of community. Even as we would say, oh, in the years following, we rallied together in a way that we probably hadn't been in a long while in this country. Um, but we can see this sort of mental shift taking place in our narratives. Um, so, why is this all important? Why are we talking so long right now about different ways of evaluating moral activities, moral attitudes of a culture? This is because, and this is where the sort of like feminist difference starts to show up. Um, it's because during the earlier 20th century, when they're doing these moral empirical studies, what they come to find out is that there is a stark difference between the way maybe your average boy might approach a moral situation and then the way an average girl might approach a moral situation. And so they start to say, oh my gosh, there's a huge difference between men and women. Now, some of that might seem obvious that, yes, of course, there is a difference. We may think differently, respond to different things, we may communicate differently, but that shouldn't affect our morality. Morality is just morality, right? Um, Morality is doing the right thing. But what you had were all these sorts of kind of like, dare I say, chauvinist studies that were coming out, especially from Harvard. Um, and we'll see this person, Carol Gilligan, down here, is specifically being influenced by these Harvard studies. These Harvard studies start to come out and say, if we look at the way boys respond and girls respond to different moral scenarios, we clearly start to see that the male perspective is the superior perspective. So they find that there's this difference between male and female attitudes. And if you remember the case that they talked about in the text, one of those differences is, when asked a question, would you steal drugs to save your spouse, or potentially save your spouse? Men were like, yeah, of course. Um, the needs of the one are worth it in this situation, whereas the female said, well, there's a more complex perspective going on. What happens if you take the drugs and then go to jail? Then your spouse dies and is alone rather than having you with them. And so what you see is you see this sort of like difference in moral judgments cropping up between male and females. And these sort of early studies took a very chauvinist sort of slant to them, and they said, look, this is the evidence we need to suggest that men are morally superior to females. And of course, while that sort of reductionistic approach kind of held water in the 1940s, 1950s, it did not. It started to receive a lot of pushback as we start to see feminism take hold in America and Europe, and they started to push back against this, saying different does not mean inferior. Different means different. Now, what are some of these differences? Um, well, the male perspective oftentimes was trending towards something we would call the impersonal, the contractual, something that's guided by reason, something that's this sort of binary right and wrong, um, something that's driven by universal values like Kant's universalizing principle. Whereas the female perspective, rather than being impersonal, i.e., we have to separate ourselves from all of our judgments, our personal opinions don't matter. The female perspective was like, no, 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 the personal opinion does matter. The personal relationships do matter. Um, and so they had this sort of, relational aspect rather than just focusing on these sort of like universal laws of right and wrong. Something that focuses on the importance of the people that are close to you, which most of us would probably do anyways. Um, but what these sort of empirical studies denoted was that while men tried to have a sort of cold, dispassionate, calculated approach towards moral decisions, women had a more partial, passionate approach towards ethical decisions that focused on a sort of kind of complexity of relationships, a complexity um, of moral gray, of the morally gray areas that, don't have right and wrong answers. Don't have right and wrong answers. Um, and this is something that you know, again, when it was first these studies were first published, they were used as a way of saying, look, men are able to make the tough moral decisions. Um, but the pushback to that was that what is these sort of female scholars like Carol Gilligan would come out and say, what is it that makes one set of values better than the other? Better than the other. Um, if there is a difference, and we seem to see that there is a difference, why is impersonality better than a personal judgment? Why is reason um, better than compassion? And so what we had was a sort of um, moral elite people, the people that were in charge of running these surveys, in charge of running these studies, dictating that men are the superior moral creature, and then women scholars were coming back at this and saying, I think what you're doing is saying uh, we've decided that the male perspective is better. Therefore, these values that the male perspective holds must be the superior values. Whereas intrinsically, is there anything that says um, having a universal approach to your ethics is the right one? And this is where what we can end up doing what we can end up doing is looking back at some of the various moral theories that we've talked about, and seeing, are these moral theories um, highlighting human values, human morals, or are they highlighting a masculine moral system? Again, that's like one of the hallmark of the Kantian moral system is this universalizing principle. Um, but if that happens to just be a masculine value system, something that men are predominantly taught and accepted to believe, is that actually morally superior, or is that just agreeing that our male perspective must be the correct one because Kant happens to be a male? And this is kind of a very nuanced distinction, because the universal value system, the universalizing principle, is one that doesn't always hold water. In fact, there's many cases where it doesn't hold water and it doesn't reflect our own moral tendencies. For instance, um, we definitely have, and this is going to get into the next slide. We're talking about what does this difference come from. Um, we are much more protective of our kids. We, the whole mother cub thing, where you threaten a cub, the mother bear will respond vehemently. Um, and so there's plenty of examples where we show partiality to the people that are closest to us. And is that a bad thing? Is that a morally defunct position? Most of us would agree no. No, you don't come at my family. You can come at me, but you don't come at my family. My family is something that is off limits. I will protect my family because they're my family. Now, that sort of approach is not universal. It's very much steeped in a partiality that is rooted not in an impersonal, reasonable logic, but a very um, personal, relational logic. Uh, and how do we end up saying that one is just inherently superior to the other? Well, the feminist ethicist would end up saying you can't. You can't come out and say that, oh, look, this sort of like universal impersonal logic trumps the way that we feel about our family. Because the way we feel about our family is fundamental. It's what makes societies work. It's what makes culture works. At the closest level, our love and value for our family above all else is well, for those of us that have that, because I know not all families are equal. Um, but our love and our value for our family above all else is what makes so many of our social structures even work. Um, so where does this difference come from? We have a difference in perspective, and you can check out our text. It goes a little bit further in some of the different viewpoints. But where does this difference come from? Is it a nature thing, um, or is it a nurture thing? And this is one of those key debates in psychology that always takes place. Are we the way we are because the way we are raised, or are we the way we are because of our very nature? Um, Without delving too far into this sort of um, conundrum, um, like most people that would sit back with a as an armchair psychologist, I would say it's a mixture of both. It's a mixture of both. Um, there are differences between a man and a woman, a male and a female, but those differences get accentuated throughout um, the way people are raised. There is a difference between giving people um, dolls where they start to create these, have fake tea parties, imaginary tea parties, and houses, and start to build relationships between one doll and another, um, and create these complex arrangements, um, which from a nurturing standpoint, starts to reinforce the importance of community, reinforces the importance of relationships between individuals. And so, if you're giving one gender a bunch of dolls to play with, and then giving another gender, like Legos or an erector set, where they say you must use your logic to figure out how to build X machine, Y landscape, etc., etc. Um, One group of people is being raised divorced of community, another is being raised fully committed to a community. Of course, you're going to start to see differences in the way they are interacting. So, as I talked about the bear cub thing, mothering is also posited as sort of like um, hallmark feature of a feminine perspective. That mothering is something that is so unique, something that men can't experience, that it changes the way people see the world. And that one gender is being raised in such a way that mothering will become the norm, because obviously the women are the ones that have to be the mothers, based on biological realities. Um, and so that uh, the preparation, expectation, and execution of mothering uh, alters the way people see the world, and that's another possible way of ascribing difference between the feminine and masculine perspectives. That mothering is this crucial action that alters the way you will see the world. Um, Though it is important to note at a point like this the difference between correlation and causality. Um, Something I don't think we had time to talk about at the beginning of the course, but it's one of those things in the scientific community that is supremely important. When we look at difference, um, is difference being created from a causal relationship, or are differences correlating through an incidental relationship? Uh, we didn't get to watch this video, but there's a fun video I like to show at the very beginning of the class, oftentimes, uh, which looks at the panic that took place in the 1940s and 1950s between polio and ice cream. Now, for those of you that don't know, polio was this disease that people got. FDR, the president, had polio. And that's what put him in a wheelchair and I believe it eventually killed him. Um, but it was a disease that many, many kids would get. If you guys remember the movie Forrest Gump, how Tom Hanks' character Forrest, he had those braces that he had to wear. Um, Common thing to see from kids that had polio back in that day, because it causes like a change in the curvature of their spine. Now, before we had our more full understanding of viruses, bacteria, infections, and all these other things, people were looking, what causes polio? What causes polio? How does it spread? How does it contract? Um, what causes it to function? And what scientists found was that in summertime, there was a spike in the outbreaks of polio. Well, what else happens in summertime? Well, kids start eating ice cream in summertime. And so for a little while, there was this sort of panic. Because what scientists were saying was that we see this stark increase in polio in the summertime, and we see a marketed increase in ice cream consumption. What if ice cream causes polio? Now, sitting in 2016, we may look back at that and say, wow, that's ridiculous and silly. But what happened is ultimately the scientists kind of fell victim uh, to the fallacy of correlation and causation. Just because two things appear correlated does not mean that one causes the other. And so the great ice cream panic of the 1950s, 1940s, as a part of this polio epidemic, um, was seen, and kind of highlights how when we're looking at what causes what, um, it's very easy, especially when you're scared and unsure, and the future is looking uncertain, especially in our kids getting sick. You want to find any sort of cause, no matter how silly it might seem. And so we have scientists coming out saying that eating ice cream can cause polio. That's always something to keep in mind when we're talking about, what makes men and women different. Um, is that difference correlative, or is there something in this difference that we're saying is causal? I mentioned dolls. Is that really a causal difference or correlated difference? Because, boys also have dolls in their own way, but oftentimes we call them action figures and not dolls. So is that a correlative difference or a causal difference? And people argue, is this something that just happens, or is this something that's producing something else? Um, Personally, I think that it is a little bit more causal than correlative, just because the nature of interaction between the doll and the action figure are governed by different guidelines. The action figure is oftentimes something to play fixed roles of, we go to war, G.I. Joe fights Cobra. There's a limited social aspect to what's taking place in the action figures, whereas, dolls, we have dolls that, like the Cabbage Patch Kids, that you are to treat as your own kid, with their own mind, their own will, their own emotions, and that's again kind of reflecting a different level of personhood that they're giving to the dolls and perhaps an action figure. Another big idea, and this is kind of where we're gonna end on looking at the difference between the male and female perspectives, is what we call the gender sex system. Uh, and this is a very complex idea that's kind of highlighting how society, we are born with gender, but what it means to, I'm sorry, we are born as our sex, either male or female, but what that means as your gender is produced by society. And so roles in society are being produced. Value systems associated with what does it mean to be a man, what does it mean to be a woman, are produced. Um, and so we're caught up in this very complex system of producing the values, producing, we could even say stereotypes by which we are able to fulfill. Um, and that's definitely kind of like the more nuanced and academic approach to understanding the difference between the female and male perspective. Not only is there a difference in how we are born, but that difference is again accentuated. It is produced into a more static form because of our social structures. Because of our social structures. And so we've now talked a little bit about the difference in a male and female perspective. We've talked about how that difference might have come about. But really, the most important thing is, what does it mean? What does it mean? Um, what does it mean that there's a different value system um, between males and females? And is that difference going to hold true? A lot of, if you guys look at the dates on all these works that we're talking about, these theorists are talking about stuff that happened 50 years ago. Do we still have said difference today? Um, well, if we posit that we do, um, how does this sort of thing, how does a feminist ethic start to interact with the theories that we've been discussing so far? One of the most fundamental things that perhaps we need to address is to go back to the DEA of ethics. If we remember, a good theory will be descriptive, evaluative, and applicable. Descriptive, evaluative, and applicable. And if we say that there is a stark difference between a masculine and feminine ethos, what does that do to our very first criteria? The criteria that a good ethical theory will be descriptive. A good ethical theory will describe the way the world is. Now I want you to think back to utilitarianism, to Kant's moral theory, egoism, relativism, all the theories we've talked about. Has there been at any point, a recognition of the difference in values? And of course, there hasn't been. Um, so how does that fit with our descriptiveness of a theory? If Kant is rooting his ethical theory in this masculine perspective of universalism, that all things are, all people are the same regardless of where they come from. Therefore, we can rationally approach things the same way. I guess. I mean, that sort of universalism, um, at some level, fails our descriptive capacity of a theory. Um, because he's rooting it in something that maybe only half the population approaches on their own. Half the population sees as a moral prerogative. He's couching his ethics in an ethics of masculinity, not an ethics of humanity. And what about utilitarianism? The other main big theory that we started to talk about. Um, well, this approach of quantifying all of humanity because one person's life is just as equally important as another person's life. We are these impartial actuaries of morals, of ethics. And from the actuarial table of happiness, we can decide what to do. Again, this is failing that descriptive aspect of ethics because half the world doesn't see it that way. Half the world says, no, we're not going to approach things. Human beings are not items on an Excel spreadsheet to be tabulated. Uh, they're people with their own partial values. People that are my family means more to me than stranger X on the side of the road. And so, again, this utilitarian approach is ignoring a very real, a very complex aspect of how we should make moral decisions. Um, or even looking at virtue ethics. Let's look at the virtues that Aristotle starts to espouse. Something like proper management of money. Is Aristotle, now today we say yes, two income houses, men and women both have to go out to the marketplace and work. But if you consider within the time frame of Aristotle, or you even consider up until like America in the 1830s, where women weren't even allowed to own property, whenever someone started talking about proper use of money, um, they're talking about men. Men are the one that have to. Men are the one that have this capacity because they're the ones who are financially in charge of the household. Women don't even get to approach this level of virtue, approach this level of morality. And so, is Aristotle talking about a masculine morality, or is he talking about a human morality? And again, we have to say, well, maybe you're just talking about the way you think dudes should act. Maybe the theories that we've been covering up to this point have this giant blind spot in how they see the world. That they did not break free of their own internal bias. And this is what feminist ethics is kind of doing. It's kind of exposing the sort of bias that is implicit in some of the moral theories that we've been talking about. It's pushing back. It's pushing back against the values that have been discussed. It's pushing back against the basic assumptions of the theories that we've been up against. Because these theories were rooting their most basic assumptions in perhaps a masculine ethos, rooting their most basic assumptions in something that doesn't even relate to the female ethical perspective. So they're failing perhaps the litmus test of what makes a good theory. Is it descriptive? Is it evaluative? And is it applicable? Well, if your theory only covers half the population, then it's not doing a very good job of being descriptive, evaluative, and applicable. And this is where not only are the feminine ethicists like Carol Gilligan um, creating a space for their own unique moral perspectives, one that's being driven by partiality, one that's being driven by compassion, one that's being driven by um, an ethics of care. Um, but they're also starting to show the weaknesses in the sort of universal approaches that we were seeing before. So, feminist ethics is not so much a new theory, but it is a critique on the old theories. And as I said, this is gonna kind of become a theme for what we're looking at for the next few weeks. We're not going to be necessarily looking at brand new theories that are for the first time emerging, but instead we're going to be looking at theories that are starting to challenge some of the mindsets that existed previously, challenging some of the basic assumptions that we had about ethics. Um, you know, in the weeks to come, we'll be looking at like an ethics of equality. And we'll have to really ask this question. Talking about the ethics of Europe during the era of colonialism, where do they start to recognize the own um, tragedies that they're busy committing while espousing this sort of utilitarian value system? We're creating the most happiness for the most amount of people, but you know what? Here, have some smallpox. Uh, Native Americans. Um, and so we start to see this sort of dichotomy, this dualistic mindset take place, where um, the values that we're ensconced in, the values that we claim for ourselves, may not be the functional values of the world. Um, and if that's not the case, then how do we start to reconcile these two different perspectives? And this is what feminism is doing for us right now. It's allowing us to critically inquire upon what we've been taking for granted up until this point in this class. Um, that these theories, these ethical approaches are neutral, um, that they're not biased, they're not slanted, when in fact they may be entirely slanted and we just haven't recognized it. So I'm going to leave you with that, guys. Have a great week. Check out the assignment. There is no quiz this week due to the fact that we had the midterm last week, so there's no new content. Take care and start thinking about the paper.